In my previous video, I mentioned that I had added an upper deck to my layout. This was so that I could have an actual second destination for my trains. Originally, logging camps A and D were modelled, with camps B and C simulated by an offstage track. Running a train to these simulated camps was just driving it behind the backdrop, then waiting for a timer to count down. I did not find this satisfying. Shortly before the COVID pandemic hit Australia, I had a realisation, namely that the scenery only came halfway up the backdrop at Camp A. If I was careful, I would be able to fit another deck in halfway up. I decided not to make it a full-width deck, as that would impair sight and reach to the lower level. Instead, I decided to make it a shelf 40 cm or 16 inches wide. This would hold logging camp B. With this decided, some adjustment of the Bradford Valley Lumber Co.'s history was required. Camp B was an old logging camp that had recently been reopened due to the forest having grown back. This took the place of Camp C, which was shut down just after Camp D had opened. The track plan was simple and based off what I'd already done for Camp D. A supply siding runs along the front right of the logging camp. Behind it, the main line goes through the backdrop. This would be disguised by a tunnel portal into a rock wall. Coming out of the tunnel, the main line then goes into a runaround loop before terminating with an engine escape track. This is slightly longer than the turntable bridge, and so can hold all of my engines. A switchback comes off the runaround loop and leads into the supply siding. On the left, the inner siding will be used for loading logs. The outer siding acts as a switching lead for getting into the supply siding. Now, this was the original plan, done up on a computer, but it is a rare plan that survives its first contact with reality unscathed. With the plan in place, I set about installing the benchwork for the upper deck. My aim with the supports was to minimise the intrusion onto the completed lower level of the layout. As such, I decided that the main supports would be L brackets. I purchased the biggest ones I could find at my hardware store, which are 38 cm or 15 inches long, and rated to hold up to 50 kilograms or 110 pounds each. I drilled holes in the backdrop and installed the L brackets from the rear, sliding them through. In order to keep the upper deck stable, I did put one support at each end. At the yard end, I used the same trick I'd employed to support the lighting. Some dowling was installed and incorporated into the scenery. It has now been painted to look like a tree trunk. For the staging end, I simply screwed and glued an offcut of plywood to the backdrop with the flat edge on top. This part of the backdrop is directly in front of one of the backdrop supports. These two supports are enough to hold the upper deck level at both ends, with the L brackets taking most of the weight. To minimise the thickness of the benchwork, I decided to use a deck of 18mm or 3/4 of an inch thick plywood. This would be strong enough to support itself without additional bracing. After cutting it to size and shape, I printed the track plan at actual size and put it down. I used my longest engine and a full-length train to check clearances. My next step was to cut the roadbed. I used 7mm or 1/4 inch plywood in order to give me a bit of scope to vary the terrain between the tracks. I then used an offcut, a spare turnout, and my tallest locomotive to mark where the access hole needed to be cut in the backdrop. On the lower level, I had used Caboose Industries HO scale ground throws, but on the upper deck, reach would be an issue. After some googling, I found MP5 point motors, which are low profile and easy to install. With the upper deck fascia in place, they cannot be seen from the front. Once the roadbed was in place, I took the first section of the upper deck off the layout and laid it across a pair of sawhorses. I then installed the fascia and laid the track. With those in place, I installed the track bus, feeder wires and point motors. The MP5 motors have built-in contacts to switch the polarity of the turnout frog, and I took advantage of this. I had also traced around the outline of the L bracket supports so that I could route the wiring around them. Once the wiring was in place, I temporarily connected the track bus to my layout and tested it with one of my locomotives. After testing, I placed that section of the upper deck back in place. I then laid the track and wired it on the second section using the same method but with one difference. Before taking it down, I lay the first few inches of the tracks on the other side of the join between sections in order to ensure alignment. I'm afraid this is where things started to go off the rails. I had ordered 2 sets of left-hand points, as this is what the track plan called for. However, the delays in postal deliveries due to COVID meant that 1 set did not arrive. But I had a damaged right-hand set on hand. It only had a broken throw bar, which I replaced with some circuit board material. Once this was done, I installed these and tweaked the track plan. This did not require too much adjustment, as this turnout only led to 2 sidings. I wanted the sidings to have a buried in the dirt look, so I took the rails off the sleepers. I glued each rail directly to the roadbed, being very careful to keep them engaged. I also used some HO scale sleepers to ease the transition off the ON30 ones. Once covered by dirt and ballast, they aren't that noticeable. Although there are 5 turnouts on the upper deck, they are controlled by only 3 electrical switches. 2 pairs of turnouts need to move in conjunction, and so the point motors are wired for this. The first pair like this are the turnouts off the passing loop and into the supply depot siding. The other pair are the turnouts at both ends of the passing loop. There's no point, pun intended, having these set opposite to each other. This would only lead to short circuits or derailments. Owing to the design of the point motors, I had to use diodes in line with the toggle switches to get them to work properly. I did not have space for a helix, and I could not incorporate a nolix into my layout. So, I converted one of the staging tracks used to simulate camps B and C into a train elevator. It's driven by a linear actuator, which I bought off eBay, and controlled by the Arduino that ran the staging tracks. At the top, a cutoff switch triggers the Arduino to stop the actuator. When going down, it is just timed, as the actuator automatically stops moving when it hits the end of its travel. The elevator itself just rests on top of the actuator, with gravity holding the 2 of them together. Alignment and vertical motion are both provided by a pair of industrial draw slides. These have ball bearings on both sides of the slider, so they don't move back and forth. Instead, they only move smoothly in the direction they're supposed to. There are also 3 light sensors on the elevator. There is one on each of the lead tracks to tell when a train is approaching the elevator. If the elevator is in the correct position, this will trigger the track power to the elevator itself and prepare it for movement. If the elevator is in the opposite position, it will sound an alarm and start moving the elevator to meet the train. The 3rd sensor is at the end of the elevator. My longest train, when fully on the elevator, should clear this sensor. As such, if there is something blocking this sensor, the elevator will not move. I've found it works reliably with all of my locomotives and rolling stock. As a final touch, I also programmed the alarm buzzer to play the Thunderbirds theme when going up and down. I mean, it does feel like something out of a Jerry Anderson production. I completed the train elevator in May 2020, and I've run quite a few operating sessions since then. A couple of tweaks to the track work were required. With them done, the top deck was now running smoothly. In October 2020, I started putting together the scenery for the upper deck. I built the tunnel portal myself, out of coffee stirrer sticks and some strip wood, which was stained with watered down acrylic paint. Now, this is where my scenery plan collided with reality. I originally planned to have a fuel depot, storage shed, logging camp and water tower on the right hand side next to the tunnel portal. That Pringles can marks where the water tower was going to go. However, when the time came to make the water tower, I found there was not enough space for it. As such, I left it off. There was not enough space for the fuel depot, and the logging cabins couldn't be full size. So, I made the log cabins low relief structures against the backdrop and relocated the fuel depot. It's now down on the track next to the log siding at the far end of the switch lead. In order to accommodate it, I had to fill in a dip that I'd left for a creek scene. So I built a retaining wall from a coffee stirrer and some strip wood, then filled in behind it with some spackling compound. Unlike Camp D, quite a few of the buildings at this camp will be repurposed freight cars. That's the look I decided to go for with this camp. As such, the loading dock is made from a flat car that did actually see service on the layout. A little while ago, I realised that not all of the logging cars on my layout were getting used. My Arduino-based dispatch system generates the logging trains at random, and there's only one logging train running at a time, so only about 2 trains worth of log cars are actually needed. This loading dock was one of those logging cars. I replaced the bogies with legs made from matchsticks, and the log bunks with boards. The storage shed next to it is a kit that's designed to look like a converted boxcar. However, I did put my standard masking tape tar paper roof on it. The fuel depot is also made to look like a former tank car. Back when I built my second tank car, on the tender chassis from number 9, I had 3D printed parts done for 2 different sizes of pipes. I'd used the larger pipe on the tank car, so I used the smaller one for this fuel depot. Now, in August 2022, the scenery for this top deck is finished. From this point on, I'll be detailing the layout as well as running trains, of course. Thank you for watching, and cheers until next time.